Life goes on. Chapter 48. Hearing that the trucking business could bring in some money, my mother undertook the venture till on its very first trip along precipitous roads that curved in sharp bends on the edges of high mountains, the truck overturned into a valley with Arthur in it. It was an adventure for him, from which he escaped, miraculously unscathed, but the truck was a complete write-off and put an end to that business enterprise very quickly. Undaunted, my mother then directed her efforts to sell bags of flour which were produced by the flour mill recently set up by my cousins Ivan and Henry in Town G. This was also where my older sisters, Rafia and Safia, had taken up residence with the same cousins, sharing the accommodation with Henry's wife, Violet, and their two children, Lorraine, who was 2 years old, and Lloyd, a baby of a few months. After the failed truck business, Arthur also joined my sisters in Town G, and so my mother traveled back and forth by bus from Kalor to Town G, keeping in touch with her children in both localities while trying to establish a viable source of income. During the time that she was away, the Mamis took turns to stay with us, and for a while, Sonia and Sukhya, the two daughters of the Hindustani Dhobi, were hired as housekeepers cum nannies. They were either in their late teens or early 20s when they came to stay with us, doing our laundry, cooking, and keeping the house clean. Apparently, cleaning the house to them also meant cleaning out the house, because after a few months of their stay with us, several of my mother's suitcases, packed with heavily gold-embroidered saris, were found to be empty. This ended their sojourn with us. I didn't concern myself with the loss of the saris, but I was dismayed to find all the pages with colored pictures from my English school book, The Blackie's Reader, neatly cut out and removed as well. The pilfering habit seemed to have persisted with one of them, because many years later, when my mother decided to give her a second chance and rehired Sukhya to do the laundry, my mother discovered that her reading glasses had gone missing. Shortly after this, we learned from someone that Sukhya had been seen at the movies in the newly opened cinema hall, wearing the glasses to appear stylish. However, it must have made watching the screen rather difficult, for she decided to return them to my mother, saying she had found them by the front door. But gossip and hearsay abounded in our little town, and perhaps the glasses had just been misplaced and then found by her. Society seems to have a reluctance to relinquish a stranglehold on those who acquire disrepute, irrespective of the validity of the evidence in their favor. We seem to exonerate ourselves in some way by finding and emphasizing the weaknesses in others. The venture of selling flour had barely started when we awoke one morning to find that one of the sacks of flour from among the pile stored in the living room had disappeared. Rather than being concerned about the theft and becoming frightened by the realization that someone had actually come right into the house and stolen something, I felt a sense of excitement at the prospect of solving a mystery. Like an amateur detective, I checked around the house to find out the point of entry of the culprit, and I was sure I had found it when I discovered a dusting of flour on one of the rear windowsills of the house and a glass pane near the latch missing from the window. Apparently the glass had been broken and the thief had reached in, lifted the latch, opened the window, crept in and dragged out the sack of flour. My mother decided to employ the skills of posing to track the thief. Posing was the equivalent of a town drunk, though his addiction was more to opium than to alcohol, the former being more easily available than the latter. Though he was tall and well built, his face was generally flushed, and his constitution was such that he was only capable of doing odd jobs. My mother knew that if anyone could find the culprit, Po Seng could, because he was well acquainted with those places in town which would buy merchandise of a questionable origin. Po Seng gladly undertook the task and immediately sauntered over to the Chinese restaurant near the end of the street that ran along one side of the market. His unplanned timing was perfect, for as he approached, he could see the restaurant owner standing beside a nervous-looking man who was seated rather uncomfortably on the edge of a wooden chair. In one hand, he held the corner of a large sack of flour that sat on the floor beside him. Po Seng could hear the bargaining taking place, and from the tone of their voices, it seemed that the restaurant owner was offering too little. It didn't take long for the police to be quickly called, because in a small town such as Kalor, distances were not great between the houses, and our house was strategically placed not more than a 5-minute walk to either the police station or the marketplace. The man was arrested for only a few moments, because as soon as my mother heard about it and learned that the reason he had stolen the flour was because he had no money to feed his family, she insisted and succeeded in getting the police to release him. She forgave him, gave him some money from her meager resources, and let him keep the bag of flour to do with as he pleased. In any case, there were not too many people wanting to buy flour in Kalor, the staple diet being rice, so this business didn't succeed either. Almost 2 years had passed since my father died, and my mother was finding it extremely difficult to manage on the funds she had. Then my sisters completed their stenographer courses and together with Arthur joined my brother Eunice in Rangoon. It was at this point that my mother made the difficult and painful decision to sell the house, and it was sold for 17,000 chats to the civil surgeon, the same doctor who had attended to my father that final day and who had given him the injection which seemed to have ended his life. Dolly, Bilkis, and myself changed from being day students at the convent to boarders, and Farooq and Salim left with my mother to join the rest of the family in Rangoon. Chapter 49. My mother was then persuaded by my uncle Ayub to invest the money from the sale of the house into the mining of mica. So armed with an English geologist and with Arthur in tow, my uncle ventured into the jungles. The English geologist showed a little too keen an interest in Arthur, who became extremely embarrassed and angered by the not too discreet attention. They must have found some mica, because a small sample of it was brought home, and I touched it, marveling at its smooth, glossy, pearl-like surface, with hints of ruby and green, and the fine layers that gave it a flaky texture. But the expedition proved to be no great success, and the undertaking rapidly came to a stop. What we did get, though, were Arthur's stories of his adventures that he brought back to amaze us. He told us of how scenic it had been as they trekked quite far north, where they even saw snow on the peaks of the distant ranges of mountains. It was in this area that one day they came upon a few tribesmen in the process of trapping a monkey. A coconut shell with a small opening facing outwards had been attached to a tree, and a tasty tidbit of some kind had been placed inside the coconut. The workman who had accompanied the expedition seemed to know what was going on and suggested that if my uncle and the others wanted to watch, they should do so quietly from a distance, just as the tribesmen themselves were doing by sitting still and waiting behind some bushes. Arthur told us of how he had seen this cute young monkey with a long tail and a snub nose look this way and that, and then cautiously approach the coconut. It put its paw into the opening and grabbed the banana, but couldn't pull it out because with the banana now in it, the opening was too small for its paw to be retracted. Rather than releasing the banana, the monkey remained almost attached to it, and the tribesman jumped up very quickly and captured it. Arthur was moved by the plaintive sounds the monkey emitted, and asked if he could have the monkey. They were quite happy to oblige for a small price, because the monkey was quite tiny and wouldn't provide much of a meal. So Arthur made a pet of him and named him Chico. The final fate of that monkey I'm unsure of, as he didn't have it with him when he returned, but I like to think that it returned to live in the wild with its own community and forever escaped the hungry tribes of the area, who Arthur said slit the throats of monkeys and drank their blood. One hot afternoon, as Arthur was swimming in a stream that flowed through the dense jungle, the dappled light of the sun fell on the water, and he lay back, rhythmically striking the water with his hands and feet to stay afloat. Relaxing in the cool luxury of the water, he almost fell asleep when, by some hidden signal from his brain, he turned his head to see a large snake close to the bank of the stream, curving and stretching its glistening body as it moved slowly a few yards from him. It seemed to be oblivious to his presence, but just then my uncle, who stood on the shore with the geologist and had also seen the snake, stood petrified for a few seconds and then quickly threw a rock downstream, distracting the snake from the dangerous direction in which it had been heading. The creature moved forward swiftly toward the splash and away from Arthur, and then slithered away back into the forest on the opposite side. Arthur made a quick exit from the water, and the fear he felt at the moment showed in his eyes as he reported the incident, for he said he had been told not long before by my uncle that should he encounter a snake in a stream, his efforts at escaping would be futile because of the speed with which a snake moves in water. He said that they had tried to identify the snake and had described it to the inhabitants in a nearby village, but they were unable to come up with a name for it. He described it as being about 7 feet long, with a large head. Its body was covered with almost greenish-black scales and yellow stripes, perfectly camouflaged for the forest and the dappled sunlight on the stream. He said it definitely wasn't a cobra, a python, or a viper, which were the names we threw at him, and which was the extent of our knowledge of ophiology. That wasn't his only encounter with a snake, however, because he brought back tangible evidence of his literal entanglement with another. It had been a hot, steamy day, and the moisture of the heavy rain that had fallen previously rose out of the drenched earth in a mist and drifted through the dense forest undergrowth. The vague notions of the Englishman, who called himself a geologist, had by now made my uncle lose faith in his ability to lead them to any area where they might find something with the slightest resemblance to mica. The closest they had come to it was when they had been trekking in the area west of Mandalay, where the geologist had said there had been considerable earthquake activity in the past, and from around that location they had only scraped a few chips of mica with which they had eventually returned. Despondently trekking through soggy terrain, they were on their way back, having finally decided to give up their mission. The Burmese workmen who had accompanied them were equally disappointed and dragged their equipment along. Suddenly one of them shouted, "Oh, Humachi, Humachi, Mue, Mue! Oh, look, there, look, snake, snake!" Smoothly sliding across the path in front of them was the body of a gigantic python, its muscles quivering as it slithered along. The beautiful patterns of brown and gold on a creamy background had them spellbound, and as the tapered end came into view, one of the workers grabbed it and pulled. There was a crash as the creature recoiled and swung back its large head with its beady eyes inches from them. One of the other men had a sharp dagger held ready in his hand, and he lunged at the head. In an instant, the snake whipped its body around him and caused him to drop the implement. "Grab him by the back of the head," yelled my uncle, and Arthur, leaping forward, grabbed the back of the snake's head in a firm grip with both hands, while my uncle picked up the dagger and with a quick sweep severed its head from its body. It was a few minutes before the python lay still, and when it did, it was laid out along the path and was found to measure almost 20 feet. A couple of the workmen then tackled the snake in a manner that indicated that they had done this before. They skinned the snake expertly, taking a sharp knife, slitting the skin, starting at the tail end. They then tugged at the skin so that it pulled away from the flesh, and brushing it with some cooking oil, spread the skin out to dry on bamboo mats. By this time, most of the rations they had brought with them had been depleted, and a chance of some fresh meat to supplement their diet was greatly appreciated. The flesh was cut into pieces, pounded and marinated in garlic, chili, and salt, fried and eaten with relish. Most of the skin, once it was cured, was given to Arthur, who brought it home and generously shared it with us. We had no qualms about having these made into belts, sandals, and purses by an illustrious Chinese shoemaker. Chapter 50. It was after my father died that I learned to know what it is like to have actually lived being poor as far as material things are concerned, but to be rich in the things that really matter. To wake up in the morning and know the sun would shine, and if it rained, it was exciting because it drummed down on the roof, and its soothing, steady percussion at night made me feel safe and cozy in my bed, a deep voice lullabying me to sleep. And if it had rained in the daytime, we picked up and examined strange and exciting beetles that often scurried for cover right into the house. There was the doctor beetle, with its shiny iridescent green back, the huge black rhinoceros beetles, which we called cow dung beetles because they seemed to crawl in and out of dried blobs of cow dung, the sleepy beetles that looked like large black peppers, which curled up into a ball in the palm of my hand and played dead when I picked them up. But the moment I set them down on the ground or onto a leaf, they quickly scrambled away. We also had stick buccees, Phasmatodea, of various sizes, from 1 to 6 inches long, resembling small dry twigs, which we caught and marveled at their camouflage. On rainy days, and there were many of them during the monsoons, when we grew tired of playing indoor games like Monopoly, Ludo, Tic-Tac-Toe, Battleship, innumerable games with packs of cards, or creating simple origami, we wrote 40 lams, the letter lam of the Arabic script, on pieces of paper and set them just outside the front door. Was it our fate that drove away the clouds or just coincidence? But in no time at all, the sun shone through the clouds, making the leaves on the trees and shrubs glisten and arched rainbows into the sky. We peered into the crystal clear puddles and watched tadpoles with small round heads and wiggling tails that seemed to have grown spontaneously out of the raindrops. We inhaled deep, euphoric breaths and filled our lungs with the fresh scent of clean, wet earth after a rain. Often we would hear the sound of a dog barking or the low mooing of a cow somewhere, as if in response to the sudden quiet after a rainstorm, and the sound would register in my mind fortifyingly alive and whole. In my mind, I walk again through the rubble of the bombed-out building, the two-story house across the road beside ours. The stairs in what remained of that house seemed to hang down from the ceiling, suspended as they were above us, the first flight lying in rugged clumps of granite on the uneven, broken floor directly below. And glass, bits of glass, melted and remolded into new shapes, smooth, rounded edges, like the stumps of limbs of the beggars I had seen on the sidewalks of Bombay. Here in Kalor, there were no beggars, only drawn faces, faces that still carried traces of the shock and horror of war. The young Chinese soldier bayoneted in the shallow valley behind Moti Mami's house, the Ponji who was tortured by being pumped full of water. I somehow always imagined that the place he was held down was under the tap at the end of the garden, the one under which I first experimented making a water wheel and thrilled to see it spin as I turned on the tap. Water droplets on velvety green leaves, globules of silver that wouldn't coalesce, but rolled around like the balls of mercury that spilled when the thermometer broke and wobbled across the polished wooden floor of our parents' bedroom, and we excitedly picked them up and admired the smooth metallic globularity in the palm of our hands. Amajani told us that those floors and all the floors in our home had had deep, rich carpets before the war, and the house itself shone like a silver coin on moonlit nights because of the special paint that had been applied to the exterior walls. The large L-shaped living room had a cement floor with grooves marking out parallelograms that ran diagonally across from one end of the wall to the other. There were no carpets here now, and a strange, damp, gooey substance stuck to the balls of our feet when we walked or ran barefoot indoors, which was more often than not. On the outer corner of the house, tall mulberry trees stood just behind and beyond the spiral stairway that led up to the veranda which ran along the side of the house. Off this was the guest room, and above it was a terrace on which Eunice and our cousin Khalid climbed to see if they could get a sighting of the new moon of Eid. The terrace, which now had no stairs leading up to it, required us to scramble up the doorway of the guest room to get to it. The same terrace where, much to my admiration, Michael Fox, the 9-year-old boy from Kingswood School, climbed onto it by scrambling up the door and then leapt off the terrace onto the veranda. In this small guest room, Rafia, my eldest sister, fed fresh mulberry leaves to her silkworms, which she kept in a tiny cupboard with glass panels on its front doors. The caterpillars, or silkworms as we called them, evolved into cocoons, which she put into boiling water and then lifted them out in an attempt to unravel the threads. From some of these cocoons that remained in the cupboard emerged beautiful, huge, iridescent, blue-winged butterflies or moths. The eye-like markings on the wings were concentric circles of red and gold with a black spot in the middle. Their wingspans were about 4 inches, and though I have checked extensively to identify them, the closest picture I found was that of the Rhetus periander butterfly of Peru. This guest room, where Rafia performed her experiments, was the very one where Mrs. French had been imprisoned by the Japanese. That sweet lady of whom I knew nothing other than that she baked cakes and tarts on commission, but was considered a spy by the Japanese. Here her ghost flitted in occasionally when it wasn't wandering around the grounds of 14 Number, the house on the hill where my mother later built a small bungalow. It sat on a 6-acre lot that sloped gently down to the stream. Here the orchard of plum, pear, and guava trees which Mrs. French had planted were fruitful, as was the avocado tree that produced giant avocados. Occasionally, when I wandered into the orchard, a flock of parrots that had been feasting on the bounty would rapidly take flight in a green cloud of fluttering wings. At the top of the driveway, Bougainvillea climbed up a tall pine tree to an enormous height, its purple paper-like blossoms cascading down in large floral displays, but of the house she had lived in, there was nothing. I knew she was there because she always left a faint scent of vanilla and baked cookies. I lived there at 14 Number for a short time after the bungalow was built, and I was sure I heard her whispering in the breeze that rustled the slender leaves of the gigantic eucalyptus tree. I also occasionally heard the crunch of her feet, lightly brushing the small stones as she occasionally walked down the gravel driveway. Sometimes she would tap on the windows of the house, but it was a gentle sound and didn't frighten me at all. I visualized her as this petite lady with short brown hair and fine features, playing bridge and tennis with my father and other friends before the war disrupted all their lives. Why didn't she leave? But then there were so many others who didn't leave either, like Auntie Joan's family, and I wondered if perhaps they thought things would not get as bad as they did, or maybe what they had to go back to was worse than anything they could imagine happening to them here. That day, the scent of eucalyptus filled the air, mingling with pine and sweet peas, when Mrs. French heard the sound of trampling boots of the Japanese soldiers on the long driveway that curved around from Circular Road down to her front door. For me, the crunching of boots on gravel always remained an evil, menacing sound, and elicited memories of the ghost of Mrs. French, pale and weak before she died, imprisoned in the little guest room above the kitchen. I had such vivid memories of Mrs. French living in 14 Number that I was quite disconcerted to be informed only recently that in fact she had never lived there. It sent a shiver down my spine to think that I had been so comfortable with a ghost I never really knew. But then, across the fence from this house was 12 Number, where sat the Swiss chalet type of house named Kenoit that had been constructed by my uncle Jakub. If there was a ghost around 14 Number, it was nothing compared to the ones at Kenoit. Chapter 51. Yunus was in Rangoon on his way back from Bombay, where he had continued to live after we had left, so that there would be no disruption of his studies at the university there. I wrote him a letter, and by way of a joke, signed it Your loving sister Jaru, Broom, instead of Janu, which I was called instead of Memuna, my real name. I liked being called Janu. It made me feel special because I was the only one of all the children who had a pet name that meant beloved as life itself. When Yunus finally arrived in Kalor, he brought me my very own first piece of literature. It was a beautiful leather-bound edition and had Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass embossed on it in gold letters. He was 10 years older than I and seemed very different from all the other people I knew. I absolutely idolized him and still do to a large extent. Kind, gentle, cultured, and sophisticated, and cynical at times, he had this way of smiling with the corners of his mouth turned down. I practiced it for hours in front of a mirror and succeeded so well at developing the same smile that it took me many more hours of practice as a maturing teenager to again turn up the corners of my mouth when I smiled. Eunice took Farouk and me on a short field trip to Kingswood Hill. He was then studying at the University of Rangoon for a science degree, and he came home for a visit, bringing with him a microscope. A rich supply of mushrooms and toadstools in a range of colors lay scattered in the short grass on the slope that separated the long road which wound around to the convent on one hill and the short, steep road up to Kingswood School on another hill. We collected some of those mushrooms, and the marvel of looking through the lens of that microscope at parts of flowers and thin slices of mushrooms has never left me. At the foot of the incline of Kingswood Hill, on the tennis court outside the road, the meandering stream had in its wanderings left a tiny oxbow lake, and it was on this little lake I once saw a flying snake. It lay there on the surface of the water, sort of purple in color, not more than a foot or so in length, its translucent wings folded like a butterfly at rest. I wasn't surprised at the time, because I didn't know that such things are rare or even unheard of, like witches on the hill who turned into balls of fire and rolled down the mountains and visited people's outhouses. I hadn't yet learned to doubt or be skeptical, and to a mind that is open and innocent, anything can exist. All things are possible. There were even 2 witches who attended the convent, and the way to prove that a woman was a witch was to look into her eyes and look at one's own reflection in them. If one's reflection was upside down, it meant she was a witch. The 2 girls rumored to be witches were beautiful Shan sisters, Elsie and Mabel Barpe, and they were anything but witch-like in the conventional sense of the witch. They were charming and polite, to add to the envy of whomever had started the rumor, and I was quite uncomfortable trying to look into their eyes at my reflection. I never did see a reflection, and I gave up the effort after one try, having succeeded only in making myself feel rather foolish. The trees too were inhabited by nas or spirits, and some were good and some were evil, and if you wandered about after sunset under the trees, you were likely to be possessed by one of them. Then one had to go through the ordeal of having the spirit exorcised. This was a scary thing, both the being possessed and the exorcism. When Ma'e Mie, a young woman in Kalor, was possessed, her voice changed. She sounded like a gruff old man, and she demanded huge amounts of food that she consumed, to the shock and horror of her relatives. To get rid of the demon, they rolled a finely woven bamboo mat around her and beat her with thick bamboo poles. I remember viewing that beating from a safe distance. I could hear the thud of the bamboo poles striking the mat, and the demon pleading in a loud, gruff voice that they should stop beating him, that he had had enough, and that he would leave. After a few more beatings and pleadings from the demon, with assurances that he would go away and never come back, they unfurled the mat, and Ma'e Mie returned to her old self. There was not a mark on her to indicate she had been beaten at all. There were not too many people who lived off Circular Road on Mylone Town, because the lots were quite large, each about 6 acres like ours on 14 number, and so there was only room for a limited number of homes on the hill. I can recall a few of the folks who lived around us and whom I was acquainted with. Harry White, who was Anglo-Burmese, lived in the house known as Rock House, and Barbara Ba-A, who lived across the road and uphill from 14 number and was a friend of my sister Safia. Both Harry and Barbara attended Kingswood School. Then there was Reverend Uba. He was Karen and was in his late 70s, a gentle, soft-spoken minister who also gave private tuition in the Burmese language to some students, including for a while Robert Tranter and myself. Just off the curve and almost right to the entrance to Circle Road lived the Martins. Mr. Martin, who was Anglo-Indian, lived in a newly constructed house with his Burmese wife and their 2 daughters, Florence and Dinky. Their house even had a fireplace, which impressed us very much because it was a rare feature in any of the other houses in Calore. Florence Martin, who suffered from asthma, had a pleasant disposition and smiled often, displaying her buck teeth that bled occasionally. She must have been in her late 20s or early 30s at the time, and her pretty younger sister Dinky, who was many years her junior, looked quite different from Florence and went to school with us at the convent. Florence, who seemed a little simple, was regularly teased by the boys, but when she didn't survive one of her asthmatic attacks, they kept vigil with her all night in the small church on the hill near Auntie Joan's old house. With her dying breath, Florence is said to have finally spoken the words which for many years she must have longed to express. "Dinky is my daughter."